Chapter 21 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 21.
Ho there, you mange-struck dogs! Broach a keg and drink to your captain's lady. Blacker Chief Dick, his eyes flashing and his face showing bright and triumphant in the flickering lantern light, shouted the words over the side of Ben's boat to a little knot of picked men of the Annie's crew who were ranged on the sand below. They were present to witness their captain's marriage to Annie Farron, and incidentally to carry the rum which was the price of his bride. The worn deck of the Pet had been cleaned and partially cleared for the occasion. Dick had insisted on this, and in spite of the protestations of the two old people, Ben and Pet, the work had been done, and the place presented a fairly tidy aspect. The empty kegs were ranged in neat rows round the gunwale. The clothesline had been removed, and the rest of the litter swept down the hatchway. It was almost dark, and the cloudless sky was a pale blue, shading off to rose and green in the west, where the first 2 or 3 stars shone faintly. On deck a big ship's lantern stood on the stump of the main mast, while 2 smaller ones hung on each side of it. They showed sick and yellow in the half-light. Standing before this improvised altar was a man dressed as a priest. He held a book in his hand and was mumbling to himself nervously in a foreign tongue. On either side of him were Blue Neck and Noah Goody. Their knives were drawn and their faces set like wooden masks. Before them, in a gorgeous, ill-fitting gown of yellow lion silk, which Dick had brought and insisted on her wearing, stood Annie. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes dancing with excitement. Round her neck hung a great silver pendant studded with garnets, and every now and then her hand would stray up to this, and her fingers caress it lovingly, half wonderingly. On the little brown hand shone a ring. It was an extraordinary jewel, consisting of a little gold hoop supporting a large flower, each petal of which was a different kind of stone: diamond, ruby, emerald, onyx, pearl, and sapphire, with a little piece of amber for the center. Dick had told her that it was very old when he had put it on her finger, and she looked at it with something very like awe. Behind her stood Ben and Pet. The old man swayed to and fro drunkenly, taking little or no interest in the proceedings, but the old woman watched eagerly, half enviously. Her bleared eyes followed Annie's every movement and each gleam of the jewels, her quick ears catching each word that was spoken. Nothing escaped her, and she noticed that the priest's garments were made for a much larger man, and that his book was upside down. But she said nothing and merely smiled wickedly to herself as the ceremony went on. The men on the beach below were not long in obeying their captain's order, and in a minute the toast was given. "Health and good fortune to the captain's lady." Everybody drank heartily, the priest more than anyone, and Dick, his brocaded coat and soft lace ruffles shining in the dim light, and his black curls showing a little more than usual from under his black kerchief, raised his glass above his head, and taking Annie by the hand, threw back his head and laughed joyously. He had once again got his own way in spite of difficulties. He drained off his liquor, and throwing the empty glass over his head, began to sing. Fair as the island, and proud as the sea, as naught in the world is sweet Annie to me. The rich musical voice echoed round the old boat and floated out over the marshes. Annie caught her breath, and her grip on the Spaniard's pulsing white hand tightened. She was carried out of herself by the excitement of the moment, the wonderful frock, the jewels, and above all the singing. Dick felt her emotion, and his arm slid round her waist, much like a snake slips round a tree stem. And as her pretty head fell back on his shoulder, the song grew louder, sweeter, and a triumphant note crept into it. So gentle, so tender, so wise without guile, oh, where is another like Anne of the Isle? Annie sighed deliriously, and she shivered with pure excitement. The Spaniard's full red lips brushed her hair before the wonderful voice rang out again in the chorus. Anne, oh, Anne of the island, where is another like Anne of the Isle? The crew took up the strain, and Dick and Annie stood together in a circle of singing men, each with his rumkin held high above his head, and his foot keeping time to the rhythm. Old Pet spat on the deck, and an envious light came into her evil old face. All her life she had longed to be the centre of a scene like this, the magnet of an admiring crowd of hard-drinking, hard-fighting, hard-loving men. All her life had been spent in dreams of a night like this. Now, in her age, it was bitter to see it come to another woman. As for Annie, she was intoxicated with it all. Any sense of prudence had left her. She was supremely happy. Now and again a faint regret that she could not marry Hal rose in her mind, but she dismissed it promptly. The future had no being for her, and the past was a dream. The thing that counted was the present, the laughing, pulsing, living present. And as the Annie's crew roared out their captain's own love song, and Dick, his Spanish blood on fire with love triumphant, kissed her hair, her eyes, and mouth, she laughed as freely and as joyously as he had done. The shadows were deepening by this time, and the deep blue sky was studded with stars, and Annie, looking up from the captain's shoulder, said suddenly, "It is late, sir. I must go back to the ship now." Dick looked at her in astonishment for a moment, and a contemptuous, cackling laugh broke out from between Pet Salt's thin, blackened lips. At the sound of it, Annie shuddered involuntarily and drew a little closer to the Spaniard, who, noting her agitation, turned on the old woman angrily, his eyes suddenly losing their dreamy love-heaviness and becoming hard and bright. "Peace, hag," he rapped out. "Get thee down thy rat-hole, and take thy sodden man with thee, or nothing shall you see of me or my cargoes from this night on." Pet began to mumble and curse under her breath, but nevertheless she obediently hobbled across the deck toward the hatchway, half carrying, half dragging the drunken Ben along with her. The company watched them in silence, and Annie, as with fascinated eyes, she followed them to the dark hole, down which they disappeared, could not help being reminded of one big muddy crab dragging its prey after it into its noisome hole, there to feast. Dick, too, watched them and shrugged his shoulders. "So may all evil creatures drag themselves out of thy path, my Anne of the island," he said, and then, as though a new idea had struck him, "Thou art right, dear heart. Get thee back to the ship. That will be the best way, and then I will come for thee. Until then, say nothing of this." Annie smiled happily and ran to the hatchway to change her frock again, and as she laid by the soft silk, she felt in her childish, happy-go-lucky way that she had laid by the whole evening's business with it. She had been half afraid that Dick would not let her go back to the ship. Now it seemed that he wanted her to. She had some sort of vague idea that she was to be his wife on the island only, when she would see him in the ordinary way at the ship. She sighed relievedly. The matter did not seem to be as important as she had imagined. When she came on the deck again, dressed in her usual kirtle and bodice, the crew were rolling several unopened kegs onto the deck, and the priest was helping them. But Annie did not notice this, for Dick was waiting for her. "I will go with thee along the way," he said gallantly, his soft eyes seeking hers, and his slim white hand closing on her little brown one. Annie smiled at him, and he helped her down the rope ladder and onto the beach. Once again his silk-sleeved arm slid round her, and she laid her head on his shoulder. They walked on in silence. Suddenly the Spaniard stopped, and his other arm encircled her, pulling back her head and raising her little white face to his. Annie could see him strangely earnest and grave in the moonlight. "You are my first love, Anne of the Island, though there be many others I have sported with," he said in a strangely quiet, even voice, "and I am a strange man. Take care how you use me." Annie looked at him with frank, innocent eyes. He was very handsome, she thought. "I pray you kiss me, sir," she said softly. They did not move for a second or so, and the wind rose over the sea and whistled through the long grass at the sides of the path, and rustled the seaweed at their feet. Suddenly they became aware that someone was coming toward them. Annie grew suddenly rigid. It was a step she knew. Dick looked up quickly, and they began to walk on. The figure came nearer and nearer. Dick strained his eyes to see who it was, but the man was in the shadow, and he passed without speaking. When they had gone on a little way, Dick paused. "Didst see who 'twas past us, Anne?" he asked. Annie swallowed, and then said as carelessly as she could, "Oh, 'twas no one of any account. 'Twas the tapster from the ship." End of chapter 21. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 22 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 22. "Nan, are you within? I've come to beg a thing of ye, mother." Annie stood outside Nan Swale's little cabin and knocked at the door. It was early afternoon, and the hot sun poured down on the gray purplish saltings. But in spite of the heat, the hut was shut up. Annie began to be afraid that the old woman had gone away, and a sudden feeling of terrible loneliness seized her. She knocked again frantically. There was silence for a moment or so, and then Nan's great booming voice came out to the waiting girl like a welcome peal of thunder after a lightning flash. "Good swine, peace to ye, whoever you are. What do you want, wee old Mother Swale?" "'Tis I, mother, Annie Farren, and in great need." The girl spoke eagerly, and her voice shook unsteadily.
There was the sound of someone moving hastily across the hut. The door flung open, and Nan's great gaunt form appeared in the opening. "Come in, child, in," she said kindly, her shrewd, keen eyes taking in the girl's white, haggard face and miserable expression. Annie looked up at her for a moment, and then her mouth twitched convulsively at the corners. Her eyes filled with tears, and she flung herself in the old woman's arms, sobbing hysterically. Nan led her into the dark little hut and sat on an empty keg, gently pulling the girl down beside her. Then she began to rock herself gently to and fro. She said nothing for some minutes, during which Annie's sobs grew less and less violent. "Now, what's the matter, my daughter?" said Nan, after the girl's grief had somewhat abated. Annie began to cry afresh. "Oh, Nan, what will I do?" she sobbed. "What will I do?" The older woman put her hands on the girl's shoulders and held her firm. "Cry till you can cry no more, lass, and then tell your story. 'Tis the best way. Cryin' eases the heart. The Lord gave women tears that their hearts might not break every day," she said, her great kindly voice echoing round and about the little shanty. Annie lifted up her tear-stained face from the old woman's knee, and carefully avoiding her piercing brown eyes, began to speak in a half-whisper, stopping here and there to wipe her eyes. "When I came home from the wedding with Master Dick," she began. Nan started at her words, and carefully suppressed an exclamation of horrified surprise. "We passed Hal on the way, and when I got to the ship no one was in the kitchen. So I sat down on the long seat and thought on the captain, and after a while Hal comes in, and—" She paused. Nan said nothing, but sat staring in front of her. Annie looked up quickly. "You knew that we had quarreled, Mother," she said. Nan nodded. The girl paused, and when she spoke again her voice had sunk into a murmur. "He did not see me at first, for the kitchen was dark and I in the corner. I watched him, Nan. I watched him come in, sit down before the counting table, and take down the slate, and I saw him push it away and then draw it to him again, and I saw him put his hand through his hair, and I heard him breathe loudly and slowly, and as though it somewhat hurt him, and oh, Mother, I heard him call me, 'Annie, Annie, Annie,' he said, as though he was speaking from a long way off. Then he laid his head on his arms there on the counting table, and I heard him breathing again, loud and fast." Her voice died away, and there was no sound in the coolness of the little hut. Then she began to cry again. Suddenly Nan spoke, and her voice sounded sharp after Annie's impassioned murmuring. "And you were married to the Spanish captain?" she asked. Annie sat up, her beautiful green eyes brimming with tears. "Yes," she said pitifully, "and I love him." "Who? Blacker Chief Dick?" "Nay, oh nay, Mother, nay, Hal Graham, my love." A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down and continued almost eagerly. "And as he sat there, and I watching, I knew 'twas he I loved, for all his foolings, and I wondered would I creep behind and put my arms about his neck, and put my face to his hair, but I minded I was married to the Spaniard, and I knew I could not wed with Hal, and I wondered what would I do, and then as I was watching him, he looked up and saw me. His face was very pale, and I have never seen anyone but the dead so pale. I thought he would have cried out, for his mouth opened and his lips moved, but he said naught. Then he stood up and came toward me, slowly, as though I had been a spirit, and his eyes were so dark and full of something, I know not what. Then I put up my hands to hide my face." She broke off abruptly and looked round her and brushed the hair off her forehead before she spoke again. All the time Nan rocked silently to and fro. Then I heard him speaking below his breath, and his voice hurt me, Nan. His voice hurt me. "Annie," he said. "Annie, are you come back to me, my love?" And I heard him fall on his knees at my feet, and I felt his head in my lap and his arms about my waist. And I loved him. Oh, Nan, I loved him so. Her hands clutched at the older woman's gown convulsively. "Mother, will you tell him? Will you tell him?" She broke out suddenly. "I couldn't. I couldn't. Not when he was kneeling there, more like a young lad than a man." Nan stopped rocking and faced the pleading, frantic little girl before her. "You did not tell him?" she said slowly. Annie shook her head. "Nay, I could not tell him. I love him so," she said. "I got up and ran away to bed, leaving him there, his head on the seat I had left. And oh, Nan, all night long I dreamed I could still hear him breathing heavily like that, and calling, 'Annie, Annie, Annie!' Oh, Nan, tell him for me. Tell him for me. I could not stay in the ship, and he there not knowing. Both our hearts would break." Nan looked at her curiously. "I will tell him," she said. A sigh of relief broke from Annie's lips, and Nan went on. "I did not know you had wedded with the Spaniard, lass. Why did you do so? You must have been mad. What will you do now?" Annie looked at her in astonishment. "I had no choice," she said. "Pet." A light understanding swept over Nan's expressive face, and she sprang to her feet. "Miserable hell-cat that I am!" she exclaimed, her great voice shaking with fury. "To be turned aside by Pet's damned witchcraft, and sent home without having done naught. Oh, why did you do it, lass? Why did you do it?" Annie shrugged her shoulders. "'Tis nothing, mother, nothing," she said wearily. "I shall not be known as his wife. There will be no difference, save that I cannot wed with Hal." Once again her voice broke on the name. Nan stared at the girl incredulously. "Did he say so?" she gasped. Annie shrugged again. "Nay, not in words," she said carelessly. "But he said, 'Go back to the ship and I will come.' So you see nothing will change." The elder woman seized the girl by the shoulders. "You're mad, Annie," she said fiercely. "Don't you see he'll take you away? When the Spaniard comes to the ship, he comes for you." Annie sprang to her feet, her eyes wide with fear and amazement. This view of the affair had not presented itself to her before. "Take me away?" she repeated wonderingly. And then, as the full meaning of the words came to her, a little terrified scream escaped her. "I won't go," she said quickly. "I won't go. Leave this island? Leave the ship? Leave Hal? No, I won't go. I—" She stopped suddenly and turned to the old woman, an expression of horror on her face. "There was none who could stay him wedding me," she said slowly, her eyes growing larger and more frightened at every word. "There was none who could stay him wedding me. There will be none to stay him taking me away. Oh!" She dropped down on the beaten earth floor, shuddering violently. Nan looked down at her for a few seconds, and then out of the door over the flat marshes to the hilly wooded island beyond. "The witchcraft of Pet Salt, blast her, stayed me once, Annie," she said, "but none shall stay me the second time, my daughter." End of chapter 22. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 23. A Blackerchief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Blackerchief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 23. As Annie ran back to the ship, her mind was full of one thing only: fear of leaving the island. Nan's few words had thrown an entirely new light on the situation. Before hearing them, she had thought of the future as simply a continuation of her present life. She could hardly imagine a world in which the ship, the island, and Hal had no part. They had become necessary to her, and the thought of losing them terrified her. She had been somewhat reassured by Nan's promise to prevent her from going with the Spaniard, but as she thought of Dick, with his determined air and ready knife, her heart sank again, and she hurried on, her head full of troubles. That evening the usual company gathered together in the old kitchen of the ship, and Annie was kept busy serving liquor. She had no one to help her. Sue was down walking on the beach with Big French, and Annie felt half envious when she thought of the other girl's smooth love affair compared with her own. Hal, too, was away. He had gone off to a mysterious summons, which had been brought to him some 2 hours ago, and had not yet returned. Old Gilbot was very merry, and as the time drew on he called for the candles to be lighted, and then, leaning back in his chair, treated the company to one of his favorite songs. Pretty Poll, she loved a sailor, and soon had the rafters shaking with his music and their laughter. No one noticed Annie, and the girl went about her duties quietly, almost dreamily. Often she would pause to listen and stand waiting, her eyes on the door for some seconds, before she went on with her work again, her face set and white. Just when the chorus of Pretty Poll was at its height, however, there was the sound of footsteps on the cobbles outside, and the door opened suddenly. No one noticed it save Annie, and she stood silent. Hal came into the kitchen slowly, screwing up his eyes until they should have got used to the light. The girl watched him fascinated. His face seemed to have suddenly grown very grave and quiet. A man's face, she thought, and she looked at him wonderingly. Suddenly he turned and saw her. Annie met his eyes with difficulty, and then dropped them before his gaze, so reproachful and yet so kind. She shivered a little. Nan had kept her promise. For the next 2 days Annie saw nothing of the Spaniard, and her spirits began to revive. Like all the island folk, she took life very casually, and as the days slipped on uneventfully, the event of her marriage, although barely a week passed, grew more and more like a rather exciting dream. She was thinking like this as she sat alone in the kitchen's open doorway, stitching a seam in one of Sue's new kirtles, when she saw Blue Neck coming across the yard toward her. Instantly all her fears returned, and her fingers trembled as she pushed the needle to and fro through the coarse flannel. He came up and saluted her courteously, as became one addressing the captain's lady. "Mistress, I have a message for thee," he said, looking about him cautiously. Annie glanced up quickly. "There is none with us," she said, jerking her head toward the kitchen. Blue Neck looked round the yard hastily, and then bent a little nearer to the girl. "Mistress, the captain bids me tell you that we sail tomorrow night," he said softly. Annie caught her breath, and the sailor went on. "And, mistress, he bids me tell you to be ready to go with him when he comes for you." Annie's sewing slid off her lap onto the ground unheeded. Blue Neck noticed her confusion, and dropping his voice to a whisper, said kindly, "Take heart, lass. If ever the captain kissed a woman, he loves you. And then, recovering his respectful manner, he added, "And the captain prays you to be secret for a while." Then, with a smile and cheerful wave of his hand, he turned and left her. Annie sat spellbound. It had come. Immediately her thoughts flew to Nan. She must tell Nan at once, for whether the old woman could help her or not, the girl realized that she was the only person on the island who was willing to do so. She got up to get her shawl and then remembered that she dare not leave the ship. Sue and Hal were out in the fields, and Gilbert had walked down to the sea. The inn could not be left unattended. Suddenly she remembered Red. The child was playing happily in the garden. He came rather unwillingly when she called him and stood before her, a quaint, bedraggled little figure biting his nails. But he was fond of his sister and listened to her instructions with great attention. "Red, will you run along to Nan for me?" she said as calmly as she could. The child's face fell, but he nodded all the same. "And will you tell her this? Now do keep it in your head, Reddy." She was trembling in her agitation. "Tell her this. He wants Annie to go tomorrow, and none can stay him." She spoke very distinctly, as though she were trying to imprint each word on the child's mind. Red screwed up his eyes in a great mental effort. "He wants Annie to go tomorrow, and none can stay him?" he repeated at last. Then he turned to his sister. "Who wants you, Annie?" he asked curiously. Annie frowned. "Oh, go along, dear, go along. Hurry!" she almost sobbed. Red looked at her in mild surprise, and then trotted off obediently, muttering to himself as he ran, and letting the words keep tune to the soft pat of his feet. "He wants Annie to go tomorrow, and no one will stay him." He was very hot and breathless by the time he reached Nan's hut, and he stammered out the words to the old woman, who listened eagerly, a strange light in her eyes. "Tomorrow," she said as the boy sank down on the floor, panting and gasping. Red looked up. "Yes," he said, and added, "and no one will stay him." He repeated the words as though they held no meaning for him. A fierce expression grew on Nan's rugged face, and she bent down to the little fellow and shook him half angrily. "You lie, boy, you lie," she said, her face very close to his. "Do you hear? You lie, for there is one who will stay him. Nay, who shall? Get back to your sister. Tell her not to fear." End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 24. "Ah, Master Gilbert, 'twill be a deal quieter than this tomorrow night, I reckon." Master Granger leaned across from his seat in the chimney corner and jerked his head in the direction of the body of the room where everything was in commotion. The Annie was due to sail on the night tide, and her crew were celebrating its departure with rum and song. One of the long tables had been pulled out, and round this some 10 or 12 men sprawled in more or less comfortable attitudes. Behind these were others sitting on rum kegs or leaning against the walls. They were all very merry, and from time to time loud shrieks of laughter shook the old ship's rafters and made them echo again and again. Round the flickering fire, the first of the season, but a bright one, sat the islanders: Joe Pullen,
French, Siptimoset, Granger, Gilbot, and a few others. They did not mix with the roaring, yelling crowd of seamen, but sat stolidly, drinking slowly, talking slowly, and enjoying themselves after their own quiet fashion. Now and again, perhaps, a young man would leave his seat to go over and split a joke and a pint with a sailor, but the majority kept themselves to themselves, neither objecting to nor wholly approving the noisy pleasure of the smugglers. Hal especially was very taciturn. He stood quietly in a candle-lit corner, cleaning pewter, and spoke hardly at all. Sue, however, was in a very good humor, in her best kirtle, and her hair tied with a bow of scarlet ribbon, which French had given her. She flew hither and thither, carrying the liquor. Annie had not yet appeared, and Blue Neck nudged Noah Goody as they sat at the long table, when the time crept on, and still she did not come. Little Red sat on French's knee, keeping very still and listening to the conversation with the utmost interest. Granger's remark called forth a chorus of eyes, some disconsolate, but mostly cheerful. Gilbot looked at the reeling crowd out of the corners of his little red-rimmed eyes. Then he chuckled. "Nice," he said thickly. A weak, happy smile played over his big, puffy face. "Nice-o, very nice indeed. Let's have a song." And he struck up Mary Lou in a thin, quavering voice. At this moment the door was flung open, and a wave of cold air blew round the stifling kitchen. Several men from the table turned to swear at the intruder, but their mouths shut quietly, and they rose to their feet as they saw who it was. Blacker Chief Dick stepped lightly into the room, and shutting the door behind him, stood smiling on the company, a slim, dapper little figure in black velvet. Then he removed his black beaver and called loudly for liquor all round. His words were received with cheers, and once again the talk broke out, and the singing restarted. Dick perched himself on the end of one of the empty tables and looked about for Annie. The smile faded from his face when he saw she was not there, and a look of disappointment took its place. He had no doubt she was preparing to fly with him, but he had expected to see her waiting for him, her big eyes and wistful little face alight with expectation, and he flattered himself. Love. His vanity was hurt at her neglect. So his astonishment and anger when he saw her come in a few minutes later, in her usual kirtle and serving apron, an unwonted color in her cheeks, and a sparkle in her eyes as she fluttered to and fro from one knot of seamen to another, leaving a smile here and a jest there, and a pert, stinging remark somewhere else, knew no bounds. He looked at her in amazement. She had not even glanced his way. The disappointed expression left his face, and a smile returned, but it was not the same smile. In the next half-hour, Annie surpassed herself for gaiety. Her laugh rang out loud and clear almost every other second, and the whole company was at her feet in 10 minutes. Even old Gilbot noticed her, and wagging his head sagely, said that good lashes were good business. But for Dick she had no eyes. Not once did she meet his glance, bring his liquor, or come within 5 feet of him. At first his surprise kept him silent and grave, so that Blue Neck observed in a whisper to Goody that it was wont to be the lasses and not the captain who were grave when sailing time came, and that times had changed. But after a while Dick's smile grew more and more pronounced, and he called for rum again and again. Still Annie took no notice of him. Louder and louder grew her laugh. Quicker and quicker her retorts. Brighter her smile, and more numerous her admirers. Hal looked up from his pewter cleaning and sighed. "She was never so happy when we were sweethearts," he muttered. Only Sue looked at Annie strangely. She was a woman, and she knew that there was a false note in the girl's laughter, and that the light in her eyes was an almost desperate one. But she was an islander, and therefore another lass's business was none of hers, and she said nothing to her, nor to anyone else. At last the Spaniard could bear this lack of notice no longer, and raising his voice, called pleasantly enough, "Mistress Annie!" The girl started, and the tray of mugs which she was carrying rattled nervously. But she recovered herself in a second, and smiled radiantly at him. "Will your lordship wait till I put these down?" she said gaily, with mock deference. Dick's smile grew broader, and Blue Neck, who was watching him, whistled softly between his teeth and nudged Goody again. "Not at all," Dick was saying, his voice very soft and caressing. Annie put down the tray with a clatter. "Oh, there now!" she exclaimed brightly. "If I haven't spilt one half of Master French's sack, I must fill it up. Here, Hal, will you go to the captain for me while I do this? I know he likes being served quickly." Hal went over to him obediently. The Spaniard's eyelids flickered, and his smile broadened as he ordered more rum, planking down a Jacobus in payment. The time went on, and Gilbot and his customers grew more and more lively. Still Annie avoided the Spaniard, and still he sat on the table steadily drinking rum. Suddenly, in the middle of a song, Dick looked at the clock, and then rising to his feet, shouted, "Get aboard, dogs!" The singing died away immediately, and all eyes were turned on the clock. The hands pointed to 8:15. Then a murmur rose among the crew, and one bolder than the rest said something about orders being 8:45. Dick sprang to his feet, and his hand played round the hilt of his knife. "A mutiny?" he asked softly. Instantly there was a shuffle toward the door, and they filed out one by one, and Gilbot, his fuddled brain just realizing that the merriment had suddenly died down, began to pipe cheerfully. "Oh, no one remembers poor Will, who stuck by his mate at the mill." Dick laughed and took it up, and the crew, glad to find him so easily recovered, joined in eagerly, and they filed off down the road, singing in chorus: "He ground up more bones than barley or stones, and more than old Rowley could kill. More bones, more bones, more bones, more bones, more bones than old Rowley could kill." "Ah, well," said Joe, rising to his feet as the last man reeled drunkenly out of the doorway, "I reckon I'll be getting down to look at my boat." The others laughed. It was well known that the smugglers would commandeer any rowing boat that might come their way to take them to the brig, and like as not would set it adrift to be carried out to sea. "I'll go with ye, lad," said Granger, and they went out together. Most of the others followed, leaving only French, Red, and Siptimoset sitting with Gilbot round the fire. Annie and Sue stood by the door talking together, their backs to the Spaniard, while Hal went on cleaning pewter. Dick swaggered over to French. "Master French," he said softly, his beautiful voice very even and clear, "hadst thou not better go down to the brig and see to thy goods?" French looked up puzzled. "Goods?" he said wonderingly, and then added as he met the Spaniard's steady gaze, "Oh, maybe I had," and got up hastily. Red caught hold of his hand. "Take me," he whispered. French looked down at him and laughed as he stroked his honey-colored beard. "Come on, then, young'un," he said kindly. Red whooped joyfully, and the big man and the little boy went to the door together. Sue slipped her arm into French's as he passed her. "I'll come a little way with ye, Ezekiel," she murmured. French put his arm about her, and they went out. Sipped a musset, then rose to his feet. "Are you coming, Captain?" he said, as he picked up his stick. Annie caught her breath as she edged round behind the empty table. Dick smiled sardonically. "I shall follow," he said. Sip looked about him and then smiled knowingly, and putting on his hat, went over to the door and out into the dark. Blacker Chief Dick waited until he had gone, and then turned and faced Annie, who was watching him, fascinated. She felt that the time had come at last when she must shake him off forever, or else go with him. She had not heard from Nan since Red had taken her message, and she remembered the old woman's promise as the one gleam of hope on her horizon, and every moment she expected to see her hobble into the kitchen. But it was getting late, and Nan had not come. Dick walked over to the table behind which she stood, and seated himself upon it without speaking. The desperate light crept into the girl's eyes again, and she began to laugh. At least she must keep him in as good a temper as possible, she realized that. So, dropping a curtsy, she came a little nearer, and leaning over the table, she asked him would he drink again. To her surprise, he answered her very pleasantly that he would, and ordered rum. Hal, who was still cleaning pewter, looked up from his work and watched the little scene with a growing sense of despair. To know that his love was lost to him was bitter enough, he told himself. But to see her happy in the Spaniard's company, to see her hang upon the Spaniard's words and wait for his smile, was too much. He turned away quickly. When Annie came back with the rum, Dick caught her wrist and held her firm with one hand, while he raised the tankard to his lips with the other. "Why are you not ready to come with me?" he whispered, as he set down the empty rumkin. Annie began to laugh again. "Lord, how you talk, Captain," she said, trying to pull her arm from out his grasp. The Spaniard's grip tightened, and his smile grew more grim. "And this is not the time to jest," he said, his voice growing softer and more musical at every word. "The brig waits us." Annie noticed that his voice was gentle, and began to giggle again. "Well, Master Dick, let it wait," she said, tossing her head. "It can wait till doomsday before you'll see me aboard," and she broke into a little nervous laugh. To her surprise, Dick joined in with her, and his long, low laugh echoed through the kitchen. Hal looked up quickly and then turned away, as though the sight had stung him, while Gilbot, thinking it was a signal for general joyfulness, began to sing again. "Pretty Poll, she loved a sailor, and well she loved he." "Peace, damn you, peace!" roared Dick, suddenly gripping Annie's arm so hard that she cried out. Gilbot sat spellbound. Never had anyone so spoken to him in his life before, and he was about to reply. But one look at the furious face of the little Spaniard calmed him, and he subsided, muttering, "No offense, no offense." This outburst
had surprised Annie quite as much as Gilbot, and she looked at Dick with new fear. If only Nan would come, she thought. If only Nan would come. At this moment the door opened, and she turned eagerly, her eyes alight with hope. But it was Sue who came in softly and sat down quietly by the fireside, opposite her uncle. Dick turned his head without letting Annie go, and called for more rum. Hal brought it, without looking at either of them, and set it on the table. The Spaniard drained it at a gulp. "So you will not come with me, my beautiful one," he said, still smiling, and leaning across the table toward the girl. Annie looked at him, and her spirits rose. He was only playing with her, after all, she thought, as she saw his dark eyes smiling at her. Yet she wished that Nan would come, although she was still vague in her mind as to what she expected the old woman to do when she did come. "Nay, sir," she said, smiling, "not this time." The Spaniard laughed again. "Not this time, my Anne? Not this time?" he questioned in an almost threatening note which crept into his laughing tone. "Here, boy, more rum," he called over his shoulder. Hal brought the liquor. The Spaniard drew his knife from his belt and held it up by the blade, so that the flickering light fell on its jeweled hilt. "'Tis a fair blade," he said admiringly. "Aye, it is," agreed Annie, as she took the rum from Hal, who nearly cried out as he saw her bright, eager face lifted to the foreigner's. Dick took the tankard and drained it. Then he began to smile again, and to twist the knife through and about his fingers with that peculiar smooth movement his crew knew so well. The girl watched him for a second, and then looked up at the clock. Why had not Nan come, she wondered. "'Tis late, Captain. You will miss the tide, and you do not hasten," she said. Dick's eyelids dropped a little lower over his dark eyes, but his knife slipped through his fingers with a faster motion than before. Yet still he smiled, and when he spoke, Annie thought she had never heard so beautiful a voice. "Ah, Senora, I would not leave the island without that jewel, which is mine by right," he said softly. "Oh, I had forgot," said Annie, feeling in her apron pocket. "Here is the ring, sir. I had it ready for you." And she drew out a little muslin packet, and unfolding it, disclosed the flowered ring which he had given her. She held it out to him. Sue, who had been watching them, gasped at the sight of such a jewel, and looked at Annie wonderingly. The girl was over lucky, she thought. Dick took the ring and slipped it over the blade of his knife. It slid up to the hilt and there stuck, a band of gold and gems round the blue steel. "You give it back to me," he said half to himself. "You give it back to me. No other woman has done so much," he added suddenly, looking at her with that peculiar smile playing round his lips. Then his voice dropped, and he said as though he had just realized something, "But to no other woman have I given so much." And he laughed again, unpleasantly, and yet so musically, while the knife fairly sped through his slim, delicate fingers. Annie began to feel fairly sure of herself. Why should she wait for Nan to defy him, she thought. Here he was, laughing and playing. Surely there would be no danger in telling him the truth. She leaned a little nearer to him and said very softly, so that none of the others could hear, "I would you would go, sir. You have your ring. What else remains?" The knife paused for a while in its unending circle round the thin white hand. The dark lids flickered, and then the thin, twisted smile vanished, but only for a second. Then the soft voice said smoothly, "One thing, Anne, my Anne of the island, one thing remains that must come with me. That is my wife." Annie began to laugh again, nervously, but conquering herself. She said sharply, "Pest on ye, sir! Will ye never stop teasing a poor girl's life out? I tell you, I hate you, sir." Dick laughed softly, and there was a new note in his voice which no one could mistake, and Annie drew back a little. "You said so once before, sweet Anne," he said, "and I did not believe you then, as I do not now." Annie felt strangely irritated by his attitude, and bending still closer to him, said in a sharp half-whisper, "Oh, but, sir, you should. A man who woos unloved is a foolish sight in my eyes." Dick slipped his arm round her waist and held her fast. He was beginning to realize that he had at last come up against a will which would not bend before his own, and a wave of uncontrollable anger surged over him. His smile almost vanished for a moment, and the knife quivered in his hand. Annie took his silence as a sign that her words were prevailing with him, and determined to play her last card. "I love another one," she said softly, drawing away from him as she spoke. A ripple of laughter burst from the Spaniard's lips, and he held her closer to him. Hal looked up at the sound with a fierce light in his eyes. He made a step forward, but drew back again almost immediately. "The lass likes it," he thought mournfully. "The lass likes it." Yet he could not keep his eyes off the two. Annie pointed to the knife which was hanging before her, and looked into the dark, smiling face so near her own. "Put by thy knife, sir," she said pettishly. "It fears me." Once again Dick laughed. "Nay, 'tis a beautiful thing," he said, holding it in the palm of his hand, the point toward her. "Think you not so?" The girl shrank away, and he bent toward her. "You said you loved another, mistress," he said suddenly, fiercely. "Is it truth?" Annie smiled at him fearlessly. "Aye, sir, truth," she said quietly. The Spaniard's smile returned, and the blue knife with the gold band on it seemed suddenly to have become part of his hand, as with a deft movement he laid the bright steel against the girl's bosom. Hal and Sue leaned forward to see this new foolery of the captain's, each thinking that his love-making was a little too open to be decent. "Oh, my sweet one, how fair my blade looks against thy white breast," said Dick, his eyes holding Annie's. "You gave me back my ring, but I am generous. See, I give it back to you." With the last words, the knife seemed suddenly to quicken and spring from his hand, and Annie staggered back from the table, her hand clasped to her breast. "Oh, how you hurt me, sir!" she said simply, the smile still on her lips and her cheeks still bright with the excitement of a moment before. Then her eyes closed, and she dropped onto the floor. The little thud her body made on the stone flags, echoing all round the kitchen like a thunderclap. And the knife Blacker Chief Dick held was red blood up to the hilt. He looked at it dazedly, a horrified expression on his usually inscrutable face. "Dead," he said hoarsely. his voice sounding old and strained in the intense silence. "She is sure to be dead. We have never struck twice." But his voice sank to a whisper. "At last we have struck too soon." He passed his hand over his forehead and gazed fixedly in front of him. Some of the blood which had spurted off the knife onto his hand now smeared his forehead. Save for this, his face was ashy pale. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he walked to the door, opened it, and went out. For a second the kitchen was in perfect silence, and then a scream, as high and despairing as a woman's, rang out loud and clear in the suddenly cold room, and Hal Graham, his boyish face distorted with rage and horror, flung himself across the kitchen and out after the Spaniard. The night was an exceedingly dark one, and Nan Swale stumbled once or twice over the loose stones in her path as she strode over the rough track which ran from her shanty to the ship. Many strange thoughts came to her as she passed on through the darkness, her tall, gaunt figure straining against the wind, and her ragged garments flying like streamers out behind her. The bitter memory of her last encounter with Pet Salt still rankled with her, and the thought of Annie's enforced marriage to the Spaniard made her hate the other old woman more deeply than before. She had sworn to Annie that she would prevent her sailing with Dick, and it was to fulfill this promise that she was striding through the night, to prevent Dick from carrying off Annie. Nan had thought over her self-allotted task very carefully, and to her there seemed but one way to accomplish it. She had decided to take that way, and as she hastened on, her thin brown fingers gripped her long staff fiercely, and from time to time she stopped to feel the heavy round stone, which was bound to the top of it, making a once harmless walking stick a formidable weapon. On she went, her head held high, and her sharp eyes fixed ahead, as if she were seeking to pierce the darkness which closed in all around her. "They do not sail till 11, she muttered, and she would not go at once. I shall be in time to catch them as they come out of the yard. Aye, that is it, as they come out of the yard. It is dark there." And mumbling to herself, she clambered through a gap in the hedge and stumbled out into the ship lane. She had now a very little way to go, and her grip on her staff tightened as she hurried on. A sharp bend in the road brought her in sight of the ship. She could see the lights from the kitchen gleaming through the trees. She pressed on for a few more yards, and then stopped suddenly, and holding her breath, stood rigid for a second, listening. There was silence everywhere, and the old woman shifted uneasily. "No noise?" she muttered. "No noise? What has come to the ship on sailing night that all should be so still?" Keeping her eyes fixed on the lighted window, she hastened on to the yard gates. There she paused again. The ship was silent as before, and then as she stood there watching, the door opened, and a slim figure stood silhouetted against the bright background for a second and then staggered out toward her. Without further thought, Nan strode forward, her staff upraised. Hardly had she moved, however, when Hal's terrible scream rang out through the open doorway. The old woman sprang forward, a faint inkling of what had happened flashing through her mind. Dick did not see her until she was almost on top of him. He came across the yard dazed and horrified, conscious of one thing only, that in a fit of rage He had killed the one woman he had ever loved. The knife, still sticky and uncleaned, hung from his fingers, and the light from the window fell upon it as Nan came up to him. When he saw her dark form and shining eyes rising up before him out of the darkness, he started back, bringing his hands up before his face. Nan seized her opportunity and, without a thought of the possible consequences, dropped her staff and, darting forward, wrenched the knife out of his nerveless grasp and plunged at his throat. Nan was a strong woman, and the knife, glancing on the Spaniard's collarbone, turned and slipped down into his neck, cutting the jugular vein. A choking exclamation, "Donna Maria!" fell from his lips. A rush of blood stifled all other words, and he dropped on the dry stones as dead as the girl he had left in the ship's kitchen. Nan heard them and laughed bitterly. "Maria," she muttered, "you may well call on her. Here, this is thine. Take that with thee to hell, you slithering coward." And bending down, she slipped the twice-stained knife into the slim white fingers. Then she straightened her back and, looking up, became aware of Hal Graham's tall figure standing not 2 feet away, his eyes fixed upon her. They stood quite still for several seconds, neither speaking, and then Gilbot hurried out of the door. The shock had sobered him for once in his life. Seeing Hal, he broke out excitedly. "Have you seen him, lad? Have you caught him? Where is the ruffian?" Still Hal did not speak, but catching the old man by the arm, he pointed silently to the still figure at their feet. The stream of light from the open doorway fell across the Spaniard's face and the white hand which held the knife. Gilbot bent down for a moment, and when he looked up, his face was even paler than the boy's. "Who? What? What happened?" he whispered. Hal looked silently at Nan. The old woman faced him without flinching. "As I came up the road, I see him come out of the door waving his arms, and then suddenly drop like a sack. When I come up to him, he was like this," she said. "He killed hisself, I reckon," she added carelessly. Old Gilbot looked down at the huddled form. "'Twas just what I feared when I come to the door," he muttered. "Lord, what things men do because o' wenches! And in my house, too. What's to happen now?" End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 25. 10 minutes later, Joe Pullen, who stood on the beach watching the Annie's red lantern swing to and fro in the sharp breeze, was startled by the sudden appearance of Hal at his elbow. The boy's face showed livid in the faint light, and his eyes seemed to have turned dead and dull, like those of a corpse. When he spoke, his voice was strangely high and uncontrolled. "Where's Blue Neck?" he said nervously, clutching the other man's arm. Joe jerked his thumb over his shoulder to where a little group of men could just be distinguished in the darkness. Hal gasped with relief and turned to go to them, still keeping his hold on Joe's arm. The elder man suffered himself to be dragged after the boy without a murmur. He saw that something had happened, but until Hal volunteered the information, he was not the one to inquire for it. Hal pushed unceremoniously through the little crowd, still pulling Joe behind him. "Master Blueneck, will you come up to the ship at once?" he said, tapping the Spanish sailor on the shoulder and speaking in a whisper. Something in his tone caused the man to back away from his fellows and step aside with the boy, and after a few muttered words of conversation, the three set off up the lane at a brisk run. A few seconds later they turned into the shipyard. The door was still open, and a bright light shone from within the kitchen, while all around was dark and very silent. Running all round the paved yard, which was long and very narrow, was a wider one of beaten earth, and as the three men turned into the gate, they could just make out the form of a tall woman standing well on their left. She was digging. Old Gilbot met them in the doorway. He was very excited, but quite sober. On seeing Blue Neck, he seized him by the arm and dragged him into the room. Joe and Hal followed slowly. Inside the kitchen, everything seemed dead and quiet. The atmosphere was cold and damp and smelled of stale rum. The fire had died down to a few smoldering embers, and the steady ticking of the clock was the only sound. Sue crouched in a corner, shivering, her eyes wild with horror and her teeth chattering. The two long tables had been dragged together, and on this rough bier, Dick and Annie lay side by side, the knife between them. There had not been time to wash the tables even, had anyone desired to do so, and the two lay among the dregs and sloppings of the night's drinking. Blue Neck walked across the kitchen and stood looking down at the bodies without uncovering. Gilbot followed nervously. "What are you going to do?" he whispered anxiously. The sailor said nothing for a moment or two, but continued to stare down at the limp, blood-stained figure whose white fingers held the thin red knife. Gilbot stood trembling behind him, a picture of a wild crowd of captainless seamen sacking his inn rising up in his mind. A strange light began to break over the Spanish sailor's face, and he stroked his ill-shaven chin thoughtfully. "Do?" he said slowly. Gilbot swallowed painfully, his fat, pudgy knees shaking under him, and his little reddened eyes shifting uneasily. "He killed hisself," he muttered. Blue Neck bent over the table for a second, and with his finger and thumb lifted one of the dark eyelids. He appeared satisfied, and straightening his back, looked at the two critically. "I knew it wasn't no usual affair with him," he said almost complacently. Then he turned to Gilbot. "She was a pretty wench," he said, nodding at the little, white, still smiling face on the table. Gilbot did not speak, and the man went on. "I never thought he'd do it for himself, though," he muttered. "But it's his stroke right enough, see?" He dragged the lace ruffles from the small, gushing wound, right over the collarbone and down to the neck. He was a wonder with that knife of his. There wasn't another man in the country who could try that stroke on himself and hit so clean. Gilbot nodded. "Aye, he was a wonderful little fellow," he said, "though I never took much notice of him. But what are you going to do, sir?" Blue Neck faced the three men steadily, a smile breaking out on his lips. "Put to sea," he said deliberately. "The men are a mangy lot, God knows, but if they'd sail under him, they'll sail under me and be glad of the change." He paused, and Gilbot heaved a sigh of relief, and Blue Neck, seeing that his decision was approved of, added, "And if ever I come near this accursed, God-forsaken island again, the devil scuttle my brig and carry off my canvas." And so saying, he turned on his heel and strode to the door. "Good night, good people," he said, turning on the threshold. Hal stepped forward and took the little knife from out the fingers that were still warm. "Will you take this?" he said, holding it out to the sailor. "It served him well, and may you." Blue Neck drew back. "Nay," he said hastily, "I'll have none of it. And mark my words, lad, you put it down, the thing is evil. The man there was harmless enough without it, but together, by God, they were devils. Put it down. Fare you well, my masters," he added, and went out. They heard his footsteps die away down the road before anyone spoke. Then Gilbot wiped his beaded forehead and turned to the two friends. "You must get them out of here, get them buried," he said jerkily, pointing to the table. "Sink them in the mud," he added, an idea coming to him. Hal sprang suddenly forward, a light in his dulled eyes and his mouth half open, but his words died on his lips. For at that moment Nan Swale, spade in hand, appeared in the open doorway. "It is done," she said, her big booming voice sounding strangely hollow in the silent room. "Susan, are you ready? Come help me." The frightened girl crept out of her corner and went toward the table. The old woman followed. Gilbot put his hand on her arm. "What are you doing, woman?" he said. "Burying my granddaughter," replied Nan laconically. "Not in my land," said the old man quickly. "I'll have no graves in my land." Mother Swale turned and looked at him steadily. "The lass shall be buried in good island earth, near the only home she ever had," she said determinedly. "And the grave is dug, and thy land or no, Master Gilbot, there she shall lie." The man hesitated for a moment, but little by little his wavering eyes dropped before Nan's bright ones, and shrugging his shoulders he drew back to let her pass. Hal, who had stood motionless watching them, now stepped forward. I'll carry her for you, Mother," he said without looking up. Nan stared contemptuously at him for a moment, her bright eyes growing suddenly hard. "Had you carried her off ere now, all had been well," she said abruptly. The boy winced, and something like a sob escaped him. But he turned and faced the old woman dry-eyed. "May I take her?" he said again. Nan made a gesture of impatience. "Aye, take her, boy, take her," she said bitterly. "None of your carelessness can hurt her now." Joe, who had been watching the whole proceedings, now came forward and caught the old woman's sleeve and drew her away, then whispered, "The lad is wonderful overwrought, witch. Leave taunting him." Nan looked at him fiercely, but she drew back, and the boy, stepping past her, picked up the light cold form of his love, and holding her in his arms, her blood-stained corsage pressed against his breast, and her pretty head with its long black plaits lolling heavily on his shoulder, carried her quickly out of the room. Sue began to cry softly, and Nan stood leaning on her spade and looking down into the fast whitening embers in the open grate. In 2 or 3 minutes Hal came back. He was very pale, and there was blood upon his hands and clothes. "I have left her to you, Mother," he said rather unsteadily as he stood in the doorway looking across at the old woman. Nan turned from the fire without a word, and beckoning to Sue, who followed her, still weeping, she went out and shut the door behind her. Gilbot looked after her. "'Tis a wonderful, strange woman she is," he said thoughtfully, "talking about granddaughters and such like, and her never having had a child." He shook his head and then turned to the table. "We must get him out of here," he said suddenly, growing nervous again as he looked at the dead Spaniard. "Here, Hal, Joe, take him down to the mud. It'll do the old place no good if folk get to know he's lying here," and he began to drag the limp mass onto the floor. Joe looked up at the clock. 12:30, he said thoughtfully. "'Twill be full dawn at 5. Then he turned to Hal. "In 4 hours I'll risk going out with him, lad," he said.
Will you wait till then?" Hal nodded. Gilbot looked up. "I had forgot," he said. "I had forgot. It is a long time since I went out on the mud. Ah, well, Hal, bring me some rum." The sky was a pale gray in which 2 or 3 late stars still shone faintly, and there was a sharp twang of frost in the air when 2 men, carrying the body of a third between them, 4 great weights slung over their shoulders, stumbled out of the old ship's kitchen, leaving behind them a girl asleep by the empty grate and an old man lying drunk upstairs. As they came out into the yard, they both turned instinctively to a patch of newly disturbed earth on their right, from the side of which rose a dark figure, who glided off into the grayness beyond. The shorter of the 2 men spoke roughly. "The witch was fond enough of the lass," he said. "I wonder she didn't do more to save her." The other answered him bitterly. "It wasn't her place, Joe. 'Twas mine, and I did naught. God knows I thought she loved him," he added, giving the slim little figure whose shoulders he held a violent shake. Pullen shook his head, and a drop of pure sentiment crept into his bright blue eyes. "'Tis a wonderful pity," he said slowly. "A wonderful pity, poor little lass. And him, too. He must have loved her, or he'd never have killed himself." The memory of Nan's upstretched arm and fierce blow came clearly to Hal, and he opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it, and they trudged on in silence. The mud looked very black, cold, and sinister when they at last reached the shore. The tide was well out, and the sea seemed a full mile the other side of the soft greenish belt. Joe dropped the Spaniard's feet and stood staring in front of him for a moment. Then he stooped down and lifted them again. "It's a bit farther up," he said shortly, and they went on. Presently he stopped again. "Here we are," he remarked, as he sat down on the shingle, and taking off his back a pair of boards specially cut for the purpose, he proceeded to tie them onto his feet. Hal did the like, and the 2 set out over the black, evil-smelling ooze. The boards prevented them from sinking more than a few inches at each step, but it was not easy going, for the limp body of the Spaniard, although not heavy, was yet not light. The 2 slipped often, sometimes almost falling. After some 15 minutes of this, Joe paused. "This'll do," he said, nodding to a circular patch of smooth grayish mud which lay just in front of them. Hal looked at it and at the white face of the Spaniard. Then he shuddered. "It's horrible," he said. Joe grunted. "Give us them weights, lad," he demanded, holding out his hand. Hal slung them over. Hastily and with perfect calmness, Joe tied them to the Spaniard's feet. He had to bend nearly double to do this, as to kneel with the boards on was impossible, and he straightened his back with some relief on finishing. "That's enough. Now in with 'em," he said briskly, wiping his hands on his jersey. Then his eyes fell on the silver buttons on the black velvet coat and the rings on the white hands, and he pulled out his knife. "'Twould be a pity to leave him these," he said practically, bending down again. "Let be, Joe Pullen." Hal's voice rang out clear over the wind-swept flats. "We'll have naught of his. Let the devil keep his own." He drew from his belt the thin 2-edged knife, now brown and clotted with dry blood, round which was still the flower ring, and threw it into the center of the gray circle. It sank almost immediately. Pullen watched him. "Aye, maybe the knife, but not the buttons. There's no evil in them." Hal shook his head. "Nay, he said determinedly. Evil in everything he touched, everything he owned. Sink it deep, Joe. Sink it deep. Pullen sighed and shrugged his shoulders. Maybe you're right, lad, he said. Maybe you're right. And added cheerfully, and I don't know who'd buy them anyway. Come then, heave 'em in. Hal bent down, and together they lifted the once so gallant little figure, still clad in all its bravery, and dropped it gently into the gray patch. The weights hit the mud first and sank quickly out of sight, dragging the silk-stockinged feet with them. The ooze clicked and chuckled to itself as it sucked down its prey. Farther and farther in sank the body of the great little captain, who 12 hours before was so gay, so sure of himself, so debonair. The dawn breeze came stealing across the sea, and a seagull screamed lazily nearby, while a faint yellow light began to glow over the mainland the other side of the bay. Now the mud had reached the Spaniard's breast. His head, still bound with his famous little kerchief, had fallen forward, and his limp arms lay loosely on the soft slime. Joe looked at him critically. I wonder now, has he struck the hard? He said thoughtfully, and leaning forward he put his foot on the black-coated shoulder and pushed vigorously. The mud sucked noisily, and the body vanished rapidly. Now only the head and one arm were visible. Now the head was gone. The dark eyes, the terrible crooked smile, the white flashing teeth, the cold silent mud had them all. Now only a hand was left. It lay for a second on the gray background, white and shapely, and then it too vanished, leaving the gray circle as quiet and untroubled as before. Joe turned away. Come, he said slowly. It's all over now. Hal looked up. Aye, he said, and his voice was heavy and toneless. It's all over, Joe. All over in one night. Come. And they toiled, slipped, and struggled back to their homes again. The yellow light over the mainland grew brighter and brighter, turned to gold and then to crimson, and the sun rose once more over an island as quiet and peaceful as if the Spaniard and his love had never been. End of chapter 25. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 26 of Blackerchief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Blackerchief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 26. One evening, 2 or 3 years later, Big French and Sue, his wife, their young daughter, and little Red Farron, whom they had taken to live with them, sat round the fire in the ship kitchen. Gilbot was dead. It was said in the village that he had died singing Pretty Poll, and he had left the old inn to Hal Graham, who proved himself a very able landlord. He had grown very taciturn, however, since the affair of the Spaniard and the girl, which had by this time been almost forgotten by the easy-going islanders, and he had taken to tobacco, with which Vendawit was well able to supply him at a cheap rate, and he sat now in a haze of smoke on the opposite side of the fireplace to French, his pipe in his mouth and his head thrown back as though in earnest contemplation of the rafters. Joe sat at his elbow, drinking ale. They two were as friendly as ever, but Poland had been known to aver that no word of Annie or the Spaniard had been exchanged between them since that cold September morning long ago when black mud had swallowed the last trace of the affair. It was late, and all the other company had gone. The dips were beginning to die out one by one, and tall shadows began to creep over the oak-beamed ceiling and dark, rum-fumed walls. Presently French rose to his feet. "Ah, well," he said, "I reckon we'll go home, Sue. Good rest to you, Hal." The landlord nodded. "Same to you, Master French, and you too, mistress," he said, without taking his pipe out of his mouth. Sue smiled and picked up her baby, who was crawling on the long seat beside her. "Good night, Hal," she said, and then added, looking round the room affectionately, "It's almost like the old days to be all here together again." "All?" murmured Hal bitterly. Sue did not hear him, but went on gaily. "Yet I would not change," she said. "These days are happier, I with my man and my little one." Hal winced, and French, who was watching, put an arm affectionately around his wife's shoulders. "Come, lass, we stayed too long a-talking," he said, gently drawing her to him. Sue looked up at him, a smile on her lips. She was very proud of her handsome husband, and they went out together, little Red following, his hand clutching French's big coat skirts. After they had gone, there was silence in the room for a second or two, while Poland helped himself to more ale from a pitcher at his elbow. Hal stared into the blazing fire. "Like the old days," he said at last, half to himself. "Like the old days? My God!" Joe put down his tankard and wiped his lips. "I reckon I'll be going home to Amy, damn her," he said, getting up. Hal looked up, frowning. "Must ye so, mate?" he said wistfully. No, lad, no need," and Joe sat down again and refilled his pot. The silence continued. Suddenly Hal rose and, standing on tiptoe, reached down one of the old cups on the high mantel shelf and emptied its contents into his hand. Joe heard the clink of coins and looked up. His friend was leaning against the chimney-piece, his face half hidden, and in his hand, which he held open before him, were 2 little coins. Presently the younger man turned away from the fire and held out his hand to Poland. "Do you remember these, mate?" he said rather abruptly. Joe looked at the money curiously. "Groats?" he said. "Well, now, I can't say as I do, but—" He broke off suddenly. "That day we'd been after fish?" he inquired. Hal nodded. Joe looked at him in astonishment. "Why, lad, you don't go thinking of that now, surely," he said. Hal clinked the coins together and looked round the kitchen ruefully. "I couldn't give her aught then, but now, if only—" His voice trailed off and ceased. Joe shifted uneasily in his seat. "Don't think on it, lad, don't think on it," he advised. Hal laughed bitterly. "You know not what you say, Joe Poland," he said. "I must think on it. 'Tis all I have to think on," and he puffed at his pipe almost fiercely. Joe did not speak, and after a while the other went on again. He spoke jerkily, and his voice was very low. "Sometimes I think I see her come in crying and him after her. That's when I try to forget, but it's no use. I can't. She loved him, I reckon. I can't forget that." Joe cleared his throat noisily. "Why trouble yourself, lad?" he muttered. "She's gone, and he with her, and you're here." "More's the pity," interrupted the other. "I have naught to make me want to stay." Joe leaned back and crossed his legs. "Oh, I don't know," he said. "There's the ship. She's your love, after Annie." Hal looked up quickly. "The ship?" he repeated slowly. "The ship, my love, after Annie? Aye, maybe you're right, mate. Maybe you're right. I had forgot her. Aye, the ship." A slow smile spread over his face, and he forgot to smoke. "My love after Annie," he kept repeating softly. "My love after Annie." And after Joe had gone home, he sat long, looking into the fire, the slow smile still on his lips. But later still, when his eyes fell again on the two groats, he picked them up tenderly and put them back in the cracked cup upon the mantel shelf. And then, after carefully bolting the door, he took his candle and went up to bed. On their way home, Big French and Sue had to pass Nan Swale's cabin, and as they came toward it, Red noticed the red, baleful eyes of Ben, the old tomcat, peering at them from behind the shed. "Nan's at home," he said, hugging French's hand, "and Ben's been whipped." The big man looked across at the lonely shanty. "God be with ye, Nan," he shouted. His voice resounded over the silent marches and echoed round about the hut, but there was no reply. French went nearer and knocked at the door. "Are ye well, Nan?" he called. Nan's big booming voice replied, and her usual greetings rang out through the door. "Aye, God be wi' ye, good swine." French laughed, and they went on, and as they crossed the dark saltings to their home, they heard her hail, expressing approval and friendliness, following them over the flats, loud, then soft, and finally trailing off into a long drawn-out wail. Rum, rum, rum. End of chapter 26. And of Blackerchief Dick by Margery Allingham.